He was born in a castle, the son of a count, and the heir to nobility and wealth. Yet he willingly gave it all up in hopes of winning the riches of the mind and the soul. Everything about Thomas Aquinas was big. He was so tall he had to stoop to pass through doorways. He had enormous hands and feet, and his head was so large that no hat would fit him. His neck was thick and his chest round like a barrel. Yet largest of all was the expansive mind of this 13th century saint. Seldom in history has one individual taken so large an area of thought and made it orderly and concise. Thomas Aquinas blended Christian teachings with ancient philosophy to effect a synthesis of faith and reason that's one of the greatest achievements of medieval times. Aquinas was born in 1225 in the mountains of southern Italy near the town of Aquino, halfway between Naples and Rome. He was the seventh child of the Count of Aquino, who had planned the boy's life even before he could talk. The plan was to send Thomas to the great Benedictine abbey nearby in Monte Cassino, where he would study to become a monk and then, like his influential uncle, rise to become an abbot. Thomas was only 5 years old when his parents sent him to Monte Cassino to live and study. He was a bright and inquisitive child who startled the monks only a few days after his arrival by asking the question, "What is God?" The answer Thomas received didn't satisfy him. He would spend the rest of his lifetime seeking to answer his question for himself. Within the high walls of the monastery, life was peaceful and quiet. Outside there was conflict and turbulence. The Emperor of Italy and the Pope were engaged in a struggle for power. When the Emperor's troops succeeded in taking over the monastery and turning it into a fortress, it was the end of Thomas' serene days of study and meditation. He and the other monks were forced to leave, and Thomas went on to Naples to continue his studies at the public university. By now Thomas was 14 years old, and he was already taller and larger than most adults. Wherever he went, people stared at him and made rude comments, but he never used his physical strength to retaliate. He was shy, sensitive, and gentle throughout his life. The University at Naples was run by Christians, but it was a dynamic place where all kinds of students and teachers were translating and studying ideas of the ancients that had long been ignored. Some were translating Arab philosophy into Latin, others into Hebrew. A few were studying Aristotle. Greek, Hebrew, and Arab thought were all making their way into this educational center for Christianity. While he was studying in Naples, Thomas began attending the Dominican church, attracted by the simple and austere life of its friars. The Dominican order had been founded only 30 years before Thomas discovered it. Dominicans took vows of poverty, lived together communally, begged for their necessities, and wandered the countryside preaching the gospel. One writer of the time described both the hardship and the nobility of their work. Wandering on foot over the face of Europe under burning suns or chilling blasts, rejecting alms and money, but receiving thankfully whatever coarse food might be set before the wayfarer, enduring hunger patiently, taking no thought for the morrow, but busied eternally in the work of snatching souls from Satan and lifting men up from the sordid cares of daily life. The humility and simplicity of the Dominicans had won the love and respect of many of the people of Europe and the confidence of the Church. Dominicans were trained in religious debate, originally so they could respond to heretics, and so knowledgeable and skilled were they that soon they were given a prominent place in the universities. Around the time he became interested in the Dominicans, Thomas received an offer from his brother Rinaldo to come join him at the court of King Frederick, where he'd obtained a position as page and falconer. Instead, right before he would have completed his studies when he was 19 years old, Thomas quit the university and joined the Dominicans, adopting their rigorous life of poverty and preaching. The decision did not sit well with his noble father, who, after all, had raised his son to become a powerful and dignified abbot. Count Aquino flew into a rage that Thomas had joined an order that had no monasteries, no money, and no power, and that, worst of all, begged for their food like common paupers. He and his wife were confident that if they had Thomas home for a while, they could convince him of his folly and persuade him to follow the family tradition. They directed 2 of their eldest sons to kidnap Thomas from the Dominicans and return him to their castle. The 2 sons, who were apparently more obedient than Thomas, willingly did what they were told. They captured him while he was on the road, on his way to study in Paris, where the Dominicans thought he would be safe from his family. For an entire year, Thomas was locked in a room in the family castle, while his parents waited for him to see the error of his ways. During this time, a captive of his own parents, Thomas memorized the Bible and began the writings that would make him famous. Meanwhile, his parents tried everything they could to get him to change his mind. There's a story that they even sent a pretty young woman to his chamber in the hopes she would seduce him back to life. Instead, he grabbed a flaming brand from the hearth, drove her from his room, and then burned the sign of the cross on his door. Nothing his parents did or said induced him to change his mind about the path he had chosen in life. Finally, there was a complete reversal of his mother's plan. It was she who changed. So impressed was the Countess Aquino by her son's piety and conviction that she helped him escape. And his sister Marota, after many discussions with him, herself became a Benedictine nun. After his escape, Thomas hurried right back to his fellow Dominicans, who sent him to Paris for further studies as they'd planned before the kidnapping. In Paris at that time, the popularity of Aristotle and science were arousing sharp criticism from the church authorities, who often tried to block these subjects from reaching new, younger students. Thomas not only didn't fear these new ideas, he was fascinated by them. Where St. Augustine had become absorbed with Plato and reconciling him with the church, now St. Thomas became equally absorbed with Aristotle. He had a friend translate Aristotle's original work so he would have a pure version of it, undistorted by 1,500 years of interpretation and bias. Then he studied them intensively and began lecturing about them, dressing them up in a Christian costume. For the first time, the church was having to confront the strength and effect of scientific reasoning. In Paris, Thomas studied under the famous professor Albert Magnus, an expert on Aristotle, who later became Saint Albert the Great. Thomas was not the typical student. Day after day, while the others asked questions, gave answers, and debated among themselves, Thomas sat, his large body slumped in his chair, quiet and preoccupied with his thoughts. Before long, his classmates gave him the nickname the Great Dumb Ox. But when Albert Magnus summoned Thomas to a private interview, he found he could discuss all the subjects in the curriculum with unique understanding and insight. At his next lecture, he announced to his students, "You call your brother Thomas a dumb ox. Let me tell you that one day the whole world will listen to his bellowings." Thomas by this time knew several languages, had a vast knowledge of astronomy, geometry, and music, and was a clear, concise writer and speaker. Although his classmates soon became aware of his quiet brilliance, they continued to tease him, perhaps because he was so trusting and gentle, and easily fell for their practical jokes. On one occasion, they told him to look out the window because there was a cow flying in the sky. Thomas slowly rose from his chair, walked across the room, and looked out the window as instructed. When the other students burst out laughing and demanded to know how he could have fallen for such a ridiculous story, he responded, "I would rather believe that a cow could fly than that my brothers would lie." The university eventually awarded Thomas a doctorate in theology, and he went on to become even a greater teacher than the renowned Professor Magnus. But first, when he was 23, Albert took him to Cologne to found a Dominican house of studies. 4 years later, Thomas returned to Paris, again to pursue higher studies, until he began teaching there when he was 31. He taught for 3 years in Paris and then traveled to Italy, where he began a series of teaching posts that lasted through 3 different popes. He first taught in the city of Anagni for 2 years under Pope Alexander IV, then at Orvieto and Rome under Urban IV, and finally at Viterbo under Pope Clement IV. Thomas left Italy briefly in 1270 to return to Paris, where he'd been asked to respond to some students at the university who were leading an intellectual revolution by trying to put forward the ideas of an ancient Arab philosopher named Averroes. This excerpt from his arguments is a good example of the fire and conviction with which he upheld reason and rational thought. "Behold our refutation of these errors. It is based not on documents of faith, but on the reasons and statements of the philosophers themselves. If, then, there be anyone who boastfully, taking pride in his supposed wisdom, wishes to challenge what we have written, let him do it not in some corner, nor before children who are powerless to decide on such difficult matters. Let him reply openly if he dare. He shall find me here confronting him, and not only my negligible self, but many another whose study is truth. We shall do battle with his errors and bring a cure to his ignorance. The classrooms of Thomas Aquinas were always packed with students who'd flocked to hear his famous lectures. A friend of his at the time wrote, "Brother Thomas raised new problems in his teaching, invented a new method, used new systems of proof. To hear him teach a new doctrine with new arguments, one could not doubt that God, by the irradiation of this new light and by the novelty of this inspiration, gave him the power to teach, by the spoken and written word, new opinions and new knowledge." Gradually he began to compile those lectures into a book, a long, tedious process, because all the work had to be done by hand at night when his classes were over. He also did a lot of speaking, but his penmanship was so bad that secretaries had to write down his key thoughts so that even he himself could read them. Altogether, Thomas Aquinas wrote about 20 books, the greatest of which is his Summa theologica, in which he tried to answer the question, what is God? And to find the meaning of life this God had given us, all through reason and rational thought. He also wrote many hymns that are still in use in churches today. He once said, "Communicating one's thoughts to others is a greater thing than merely thinking." Here is one of his greatest hymns, a piece that can be appreciated by lovers of poetry, lovers of God, or anyone who simply admires the idea of a man who could with one hand write concise, rational, scholarly arguments, and with the other could write lyrical songs of devotion. "Sing, O tongue, the mystery of the body glorious, and of blood beyond all price, which, in ransom of the world, fruit of womb most bountiful, all the people's King poured forth, given to us and born for us from an untouched maid, and sojourning on the planet, spreading seed of world-made flesh, as a dweller with us lowly, wondrously he closed his stay. In the night of the Last Supper, with apostles while reclining, all the ancient law observing in the food by law prescribed, food he gives to 12 assembled, gives himself with his own hands. Word made flesh converts true bread with a word into his flesh. Wine becomes the blood of Christ, and if sense should fail to see, let the pure in heart be strengthened by an act of faith alone. Therefore such great sacrament venerate we on our knees. Let the ancient liturgy yield its place to this new rite. Let our faith redeem the failure of our darkened sense. To begetter and begotten, praise and joyful song, salutation, honor, power, blessings manifold, and to him from both proceeding let our equal praise be told. Although he attained great fame in his own lifetime, Thomas continued to lead a simple and devout life. Every day he spent many hours in prayer and meditation, said one Mass or heard 2 each morning, and was so engrossed by God that it filled every moment of his waking day. Before a sermon or a lecture, before he sat down to study, read, or write, he prayed. His fellow monks said they thought he owed his knowledge less to the effort of the mind than to the virtue of his prayer. Even on the margins of his manuscripts, he would scribble an occasional prayer or invocation like a sudden Ave Maria with an exclamation point. His thoughts were so consumed that he often had no awareness of what was happening around him. At dinner, his plate would be removed and replaced without him even noticing. Once at a supper with King Louis IX, he became absorbed in meditation during the meal and suddenly struck his fist on the table, exclaiming, "That is the decisive argument against the Manichaeans." He was scolded by his prior, but the king graciously directed an attendant to bring his distracted dinner guest some writing materials, so he could record his idea before it was forgotten. Thomas refused all appointments to high posts, including one to serve as the Archbishop of Naples. He was a calm man who had strength of conviction without arrogance. His manner was patrician as his background, but he was modest and kind, thus earning the affection even of his opponents. His nickname was the Angelic Doctor. When he was given sainthood years after his death, a witness who knew him testified, "He was soft-spoken, easy in conversation, cheerful and bland of countenance, generous in conduct, most patient, most prudent, radiant with charity and gentle piety, wondrous compassionate to the poor. Thomas had an intuitive understanding and respect for all types of people. He was known for how he would adjust his sermons and lectures to suit his audience, whether they be students and scholars or common folk. None of his writings contain any pride or ego, and he went out of his way to give credit to others from the past whose ideas he'd borrowed. When Thomas was 43, he returned to Paris to teach at the university, but only 4 years later he was back in Italy, this time to found a Dominican house of studies in Naples. That stay lasted 2 years. During that time, Thomas suddenly stopped writing. At the age of 48, he had a mystical experience that he said made all his writings seem like straw compared to what he had seen. Then, in 1274, he was summoned by the Pope to attend a church council in Lyon. It was his last journey. Thomas set out on the long mule ride through Italy, but his health had been damaged by years of overwork and study, and he was taken ill along the way. He died at a monastery between Naples and Rome, never having made it to France. The date was March 7th, 1274, and he was 49 years old. He was canonized, given sainthood, only a half-century after his death, in the year 1323. 200 years later, he was made a doctor of the Church. Thomas Aquinas developed a philosophical system that is often called the supreme synthesis. His broad and original mind was able to take the teachings of Plato, Aristotle, and St. Augustine, the greatest thinkers who'd preceded him, and blend them into a total point of view which was faithful to the orthodox teachings of the Catholic Church. Yet he never lost the logic and reasoning that had made these philosophies so popular, and in fact utilized them to their fullest. Thomas belonged to a philosophical school referred to as scholasticism. The scholastics emphasized the use of reason in exploring profound questions of philosophy and theology. They used their reason to try and reconcile contradictory viewpoints in Christian theology. Scholasticism had its greatest influence between the 1000s and 1400s, and particularly in the 1200s when Thomas lived. Its followers developed a very formal and sophisticated method of investigating questions that started with the teacher first stating a problem. The students then listed the arguments for and against a solution to the problem, then formed a personal opinion. Finally, they responded to each argument on every side of the issue until they reached a balanced solution. Those who studied scholasticism developed an ability to approach problems logically and rationally, and to state their arguments briefly and clearly. Because Aristotle had used logic to try and prove the existence of God, he had a strong effect on scholastics. The goal of the scholastics was to try and reconcile Aristotle's philosophy with Christianity. It was Thomas Aquinas who achieved this most ably and who remains the most important medieval scholastic. The respect Thomas held for Aristotle was so great that he referred to him simply as the philosopher. In some of his works he quotes Aristotle on almost every page, although he doesn't hesitate to take argument with him when the philosopher has strayed from Christian thought. Here is an example of how he blended Aristotle's beliefs with that of Christianity. From Aristotle he took the concept of a final end or purpose, at which all action on earth is ultimately directed. Like Aristotle, he saw the attainment of this end as the key to human happiness. But for Thomas, this end, this happiness, was to be found in the love of God, whereas for Aristotle, it was found in living a virtuous life. Thomas found a way to integrate Aristotle's view. He said that since a person couldn't fully succeed in knowing God during life on earth, the final reward is heaven, where that goal can finally be reached. Heaven, however, is attainable only to those who merit it. And even then, he said, it is given through God's grace and not as a right. The sacraments of the Church, in his mind, were essential in communicating God's grace to people. Since true communion can only happen in heaven, and even that requires special grace, then Thomas said the only way to find happiness on earth was by living a life of virtue and friendship. This is exactly what Aristotle had recommended. There were two books that are considered Thomas' greatest works, and which serve as the basic theology for the Catholic Church. The first one, written in 1259 when he was 34, is called Summa contra Gentiles. The second one, Summa theologica, was written over a 6-year period when he was between the ages of 42 and 48. During these years, he also wrote a series of commentaries on Aristotle and the Bible. The two Summa books require enormous intellectual labor. Thomas always states opposing viewpoints clearly and fairly. His style is simple and direct, without any flourishes and none of the imagination and flair that St. Augustine showed. It is instead the work of a scholar who believed philosophy was a serious matter, and it was unseemly to mix it up with poetry. That was a separate matter. Each book held the conviction that Christian faith and revelation and human knowledge both led to truth. Both come from God, and therefore can't be in conflict with each other. If there is conflict, it's the result of faulty thinking. The Summa Theologica is a monumental work. It is 21 volumes long, covers fully the topics of metaphysics, psychology, ethics, and law. Contains 631 questions and 10,000 objections or replies. The whole work is divided into 3 parts. The first deals with the existence and nature of God and the universe he created. The second with human activity and ethics. And the third with Christ and the sacraments. In each part, Thomas first poses questions. Then he presents his opponent's arguments and his own, and finally he refutes his opponents. The theme throughout is that there is no contradiction between the truths of faith and those of human reason. Thomas stated that he believed in God on faith. However, using his reason, he also formulated 5 proofs of God's existence to support his belief. Thomas also spoke about government, which he felt had a moral responsibility to serve people and help them lead virtuous lives. In fact, he's been called the first Whig because in some ways he was a pioneer of constitutional government. Under no circumstances, he wrote, should government violate human rights, which he defined as education, religion, and reproduction. Rulers should create peace, conserve life, and preserve the state, and support what he called life of the multitude good in accordance with the purpose of life, which is heavenly happiness. He also taught that all laws, to be truly just, must be in harmony with divine law. If they were not, then the people had a duty to disobey those laws. Thomas was the first to write a standard for what could be called civil disobedience. St. Thomas was perhaps the most important person in the history of the Church when it came to establishing views on the existence of angels. Thomas felt angels held the key position between God and human beings. There were countless numbers of angels, he taught, and all were immortal. These angels knew everything except that which depended on human choice and that which is known only to God. They serve as ministers of God in the government of the world, and they move and guide the heavenly bodies. Thomas said, "Every man has an angel appointed to guard him, and the archangels have the care of multitudes of men." He wrote 93 pages on the angels, their hierarchy, movements, nature, and habits. It was Thomas' writings on angels that influenced John Milton's portrayal of them when he wrote his famous epic poem, Paradise Lost. Thomas Aquinas was a man of rare and superb intellect, who put that intellect into the service of his faith. He is the theologian of Catholicism. If the Church can be said to have a philosophy, it is the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. His work remains the basis of Catholic teaching to this day, and students, theologians, philosophers, and scholars, both within and without the Church, still study his writings. Thomas is known chiefly as a rationalist. That is, he upheld reason as a respected way to expand human knowledge. As a result, he helped make science respectable again in Europe after a long period in which it had been considered pagan or non-Christian. But Thomas was more than a rationalist. He was also a mystic, a man whose thoughts were absorbed in God from the moment he awoke each morning, and who experienced certain revelations or communions that had such a profound effect on him, he eventually abandoned his writings. It was this blend of mystical longing for God and intellectual pursuit of the truth that made him such a perfect spokesman for his church and the times in which he lived. Europe was entering the age of reason, and religion needed a person who could meet that age on its own terms. Thomas Aquinas introduced reason to Christianity in such a way that they formed a compatible and enduring union. He once stated, "Of all human pursuits, the pursuit of wisdom is the most perfect, the most sublime, the most profitable, the most delightful." In his work and writing, he tried to aid that pursuit, and in so doing he charted a new path for human thought that led society from the age of faith to the age of reason, and towards a synthesis of both.